This video is going to move into section 1 of Kant's Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals. Again, I'm using the James Ellington translation that's published by Hackett. So in the preface to the Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant had emphasized that what he's doing is pursuing the pure area of ethics. He's not interested in what he calls the empirical side, which is focused on particular applications. He thinks that that basically is a part of anthropology, looking at the specific ethical situations and ethical problems that arise and that are particular to social situations and historical context and all that kind of stuff. Kant sees that as an anthropological concern, and to ground ethics proper requires working through this sort of pure part. The main reason for that is because the pure ethics can be universal. If you're able to generate in the abstract a rule or a law that governs human action, it should be applicable in all of those specific contexts that belong to anthropology, right? So Kant is, one, working at a very high level of abstraction for the purposes of gleaning a universal, he wants to discern this universal moral law that would be applicable in all times and all places to all people, insofar as those people are rational. And so I want to say a little bit more about that here in a second. So I guess this video does come with a content warning that I will be discussing issues of racism, racial slurs, and sexism. We need to talk a little bit about that because Kant played a role in the development of the sort of theoretical side, not surprisingly, I guess, there, of scientific racism in the very early 19th and the late, of course, 18th centuries. So more on that in just a second. So in addition to this emphasis on the pure part of ethics, Kant also said at the end of the preface that the goal of the groundwork is to figure out basically what is the supreme principle of morality. Now later he'll say very explicitly that the autonomy of the will is the supreme principle of morality. We've seen that there are contenders for such a supreme principle, right? Some people might say, well, the ultimate good is happiness. That's what grounds our ethical theory. That's what everyone's seeking in their life. That's the all particular goods lead to. We do it because we think ultimately it will make us happy, and so on. Kant's going to address that right off the bat. So in the beginning of the first section, there's a couple of things that we can do here. Develop a vocabulary, basically. We'll get some of the key terms that Kant is going to use. And he's going to develop these terms throughout. So a couple of those key terms, for instance, are going to be the will, the goodwill specifically, duty. We're going to learn a bit about Kant's theory of how intention works. It's very closely related to the will, as is his idea of reason and what reason does, and we've already seen that reason plays a role in rule making. And we'll also start to talk a bit about autonomy. And now this is a really important concept, and in fact, if you really get down to it, one of I think the primary reasons to even study Kant is to think about his formulation of autonomy. So we'll see why he calls the autonomy of the will the supreme principle of morality. The first section begins very straightforward. I mean, he just says straight out that there's nothing that is good without qualification except a good will. So that raises a couple of questions. What's a will? Why can a will be good without qualification? So we're thinking about the will as something that can be good sort of in itself, and that language I think is important for Kant, this language of in itself, and sort of why the will is capable of being good sort of in itself, for its own sake. The language that we've seen, for instance, in Plato, when Socrates and Glaucon are discussing the different kinds of good, right? We'll see actually that Kant doesn't think that the will is good for its consequences or its effects. This is something that he says on the very first page. And in fact, a good will can be good even if it never affects anything, even if it doesn't accomplish its goal. And again, we'll see that in part this is due to the sort of purely formal aspects of the will. So he says, a good will is good not because of what it affects or accomplishes, nor because of its fitness to attain some proposed end. It is good only through its willing, that is, it is good in itself. So he's going to make a case that the will becomes one of the most important elements of our moral life, and one of the purposes of reason, so one of the functions that reason is supposed to play, is actually to produce a good will, a will that's good in itself. Now, what makes a good will good depends a lot on its relationship to duty. Now, in the early text, Kant does not really give us a great definition of what duty is. He says that it's the necessity of an act committed out of respect for the moral law. That doesn't really give us too much of an end to the concept. So we know that it has to do with a moral law, which Kant takes to be universal. So universality is going to play a key role here. And we know it's going to have to do something with respect and necessity. But as we'll see, because Kant takes the will to be free, it can't be a kind of causal necessity. It has to be a kind of formal or logical necessity. If it were a causal necessity, there wouldn't be any choice about it, right? The will would just flow like dominoes, one action following the other by causal necessity. So the kind of necessity that duty demands from the will is a little bit different than that. Like I said, it's more of a formal or a logical necessity, and we'll see how that develops. One of the things to keep in mind when we're working through this text is, since Kant is trying to sort of deduce the moral law from reason, it's almost like the concepts are going to nest within one another. It's going to be like peeling an onion or opening, a Russian nesting doll, where we start with the will and then we start to kind of open that up and go deeper within it until we find sort of the kernel of this supreme principle of morality that Kant claims he's trying to discover in the grounding. So you'll notice that things are all connected. One of the things that you'll have to work on as we move through Kant is kind of keeping all the pieces and how they relate to each other, because more so than other theories of ethics that we've discussed, this particular theory is a logical system that relies upon all of the parts sort of hanging together in a particular way. So a lot of the arguments that Kant makes, you can kind of understand them as being like him unpacking how all the parts of his logical system fit together, and then once you see them all sort of click into place, his conclusions then follow, like, oh, because of this, and how they relate to each other, then this thing will follow from it. So as we move into the kind of more specific arguments of the grounding, I think you'll see that play out a little bit more. Okay, so immediately Kant gets into the substantial arguments of the grounding by introducing the idea of the goodwill and discussing its relationship to happiness. So one of the things that Kant has to overturn early on is that happiness is not really the ultimate point. There's a lot of ethical theories that place a high value on happiness. Utilitarianism is one. Epicureanism, cynicism. There's a wide variety of, philosophical schools that happiness plays sort of a key role. Kant is going to admit that, of course, oftentimes we are doing our duty by promoting happiness, but happiness can't be the ultimate purpose, right? And in fact, reason is so ill-equipped to secure our happiness that it would be sort of strange if happiness in fact were the ultimate sort of principle. I'll talk a bit about his argument here. So remember, because of the formal element of Kant's philosophy, he's not interested in the consequences of an action. That's one of the reasons why he's not interested in happiness as being the ultimate principle. Happiness is, we are supposed to do an action because we think it will lead to the outcome of happiness. For Kant, that has everything sort of wrong, right? We can't do anything because we hope to accomplish something. Our action has to be able to have a moral value even if it doesn't accomplish it. So he says, even if by some especially unfortunate fate or by the the provision of a stepmotherly nature. Wait a second. This word. Students always ask me when we read this translation about this word. And first of all, it actually, despite the way that it looks, doesn't have any relation to the racial epithet, right? It's not related to the N-word. But boy, it looks close, right? So it is a false friend. The word means basically stingy or withholding. Now, we can't let Kant exactly off the hook, even though this particular moment is an issue with translation. It's just using an archaic word that authors today, translators today, would probably avoid, because even though it's actually not related at all to the racial slur, it looks an awful lot like it. But it gives students pause, right? And it strikes a lot of different students in different ways, right? And so I always get questions about this word. So I take a moment here just to explain that what Kant's saying here is that if there's some sort of something being withheld from the will, something that makes it unable to achieve its goal, then it will still be good. Now, okay, so we let Kant off the hook for just a second. Maybe this particular passage isn't racist. It's a particularly unfortunate word choice by the translator. But the example he gives is sexist. A stepmotherly nature. Playing on that stereotype of the wicked stepmother, like in Cinderella. The stepmother's very generous and caring toward her own children, but with Cinderella, she is cruel and she withholds her affection. So playing on this trope, notice it says stepmotherly nature, that there's some sort of inherent nature of stinginess or withholding in this sort of stepmotherly role, right? Or in a person who has to perform that role. There's been some really good current work by Sarah Ahmed or Kate Mann, who discusses the sort of sexist idea that women owe people care and nurturing, that these feminine coded goods of support and and that women are judged very harshly for not giving these feminine coded social goods when they're expected, right? That, oh, you're cold, you're not nurturing enough, you're not giving enough, you're not being supportive, and women are face particularly strong repercussions for withholding these. Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex also mentioned this. So I want to point this example out in Kant because, on the one hand, Kant is really worried about how our particular biases, the particular circumstances of our lives, our tendencies, he'll talk a lot about our tendencies and our proclivities towards certain things, are a danger, or they're a worry when we're thinking about ethics. One of the reasons why we need an abstract and universal moral law is exactly to avoid the pitfalls of our particular circumstances and things that are prejudicial in the sense of we haven't thought about them, we haven't made a judgment about them, right? They're prejudgmental, prejudicial. So here we have an example of Kant's own sort of prejudices creeping into the text, right? And even though in this particular instance we can let Kant off the hook for racism, we can't fully, because in his Anthropology, I think translated mostly in most editions as Anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, Kant says all kinds of racist things about people from Africa, people from Asia. One of the key elements of Kant's racism, right, which, Kant really helped to lay the theoretical ground for scientific racism, as I said, color coding and dividing the human races into white, black, yellow, and red, and all of that kind of stuff. One of the key racist things that Kant says is that different races have different aptitude to reason. Well, if reason and our capacity to reason is tied to our moral worth, then the moral worth of people who are less capable at utilizing their rational capacity are drawn into moral question. So we really need to think through this problem that is all over Enlightenment and early modern texts. Thinkers who, like Kant, on the one hand, are advocating for universal morality, universal human rights. You have these Enlightenment era declaration of the rights of men and so on. But then you have sort of outright racism on the other hand, right? All men are created equal, but the people who wrote that are owning slaves and counting, black slaves as less than full persons for, governmental reasons and things like that, governmental and racist reasons. So I don't think that we can just brush aside Kant's racism as just, we don't need to worry about. So then you might say, well, why even, keep up with Kant? Why keep teaching Kant? There's a couple of reasons, I think, to continue to read texts like Kant, despite, and it's actually sometimes because Kant is racist in other places. One is it's widely influential. The discussion of autonomy is just everywhere, right? And you can trace a lot of that stuff back to sort of the discussion that's going on in Kant and in other places in German idealism. But it's not just influential in a broad sense, it's also specifically influential in liberation movements. So on the one hand, while Kant is kind of a villain because of the racist things he says in the Anthropology, he's also a source of inspiration for liberation movements in a way. It's a weird kind of position philosophically to be in. One of the reasons you get such a powerful thought in Martin Luther King, the arc of history bends towards justice, is because King read Hegel, and Hegel had ideas of progress and historical development, and also is a racist, who says things about how Africa has no history and all of this, kind of stuff. So there's that kind of double role, this sort of double influence, both negative and positive. I think that there's something valuable still to think about this project of universal value and reason. Even if it falls short, even if there's things that we should be criticizing and skeptical in it, I think it's worth really considering seriously this push toward universal rights that happened in the Enlightenment, even though the specific people who advocated for them fell far, far, far short of the ideals that they sort of left us. In a lot of ways, this isn't even about Kant, really, right? I'm not interested, or I don't care to really defend Kant in any way, but rather to think about why we still read certain canonical texts that are associated with people who who have really bad ideas in other areas about things that we shouldn't just brush away, or we shouldn't just ignore and say, oh, he's a product of his time, or anything like that. I've mentioned before that, of course, people at the time knew that slavery and racism were bad. Slaves knew that it was bad to be enslaved. That kind of thing, right? In addition to other philosophers who were abolitionists and who were advocates for more equitable views of, or getting beyond sort of racialized thinking and things like that, right? So it's not something that we can just shrug off and, oh, it's a product of this time and all that kind of thing. So this is something I think when we hear all of this talk about universal reason, we should have this question sort of in the back of our mind. Universal in what sense, right? Kant's clear that it's creatures with a capacity for reason. And we need to be careful to whom does that get extended? Who has this rational capacity? And so on and so forth. So that's the sort of general issue, I think, to keep in mind as we work through Kant. Some of the problems that we'll discuss with deontology and Kant's moral theory will have to do exactly with the kind of abstract universalism that he is advocating here. So I just want to, what does he really mean by universal? Who gets the capacity for reason? Because as soon as you mess with the capacity for reason, you risk degrading or indicting somehow someone's moral worth, right? You need that capacity to self-govern in order to have a goodwill, and the goodwill is of paramount importance for Kant, and it's the whole purpose of reason for Kant is to produce a will that is good, the only thing that can be good without qualification. So that is where we will stop with this particular video. I'm going to pick up and continue on with section 1, and then discuss the 3 propositions that Kant lays out using the different examples. So what he's going to turn to do is he wants to look at situations in which it's hard to follow your duty. He's suggested that we need to bring our will in accordance with duty and do our duty, but he needs to sort of now dig in and explain sort of what that's like. So he's going to turn and look at situations in which it's difficult to do your duty, because these will be for Kant the sort of test situations. So I'll leave this video here, and I will pick up really just on page 8 and 9, just that still early on in the first section.